It really does, I think, reach new depths to suggest somehow that the poorest people in this country are somehow going to be better off if we continue exploiting more oil and gas, when we know very, very clearly that it is new oil and gas and existing oil and gas that is so expensive. And he cited the example of Siemens talking about the expensiveness of renewables, but that's precisely because they are linked to the price of gas. And that is why we need to reform the totally out-of-date electricity and gas system that we have in this country today. And I think it tells us all we need to know about this cynical and failing government, that the first legislation that it was going to debate in this House in 2024 was a bill to mandate the annual licensing of oil and gas projects in the North Sea. Not legislation that rises to the immediate challenges that we face as a society, from the cost of living scandal, which sees families unable to meet their basic needs, to the planetary emergency rapidly unfolding before our eyes, but instead a bill that is frankly no more than a political stunt at home, yet at the same time a very dangerous signal to other countries abroad of a UK doubling down on the fossil fuel economy. There should be a massive scaling up of renewables and to back cheap and abundant energy sources like onshore wind, for which a grand total of 0 applications have been submitted since planning rules were changed in September. There should be a nationwide, street-by-street energy efficiency programme to ensure families have warm homes for the long term, rather than scrapping the upgrade in standards in private rented homes, which, according to the Climate Change Committee, could have saved tenants £250 a year, even at so-called normal prices, let alone at a time when prices are spiralling. And again, what an indictment of this government. Remember the Green Deal back in, when was it, 2012 or something? They set the interest rate so ridiculously high, as we all said at the time, that not surprisingly the whole plan collapsed. And those homes were not insulated, and plenty of energy companies, including some in my own constituency, went bust as a result. They are incompetent as well as totally ideologically driven. They should be properly taxing the filthy profits of oil and gas companies, rather than foisting the cost of new developments onto the taxpayer. And they should urgently withdraw from the dangerous Energy Charter Treaty, which, it beggars belief, allows us to be sued by fossil fuel companies. A fairer and greener energy system is entirely possible, but it requires both imagination and investment, 2 qualities which I do not associate with this government. This legislation makes it painfully clear that the government are willfully ignoring the lessons of both the climate and the energy crises, and are once again privileging their own interests above the well-being of people and planet. This bill sends exactly the wrong signal at the wrong time, and actively undermines global efforts to address the climate emergency by hampering that diplomacy and giving the green light to further extraction right around the world. It's not what leadership looks like, it's not what this moment demands, and our constituents, all of them, deserve better.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady for Brighton Pavilion. While we don't always...
This really is a reprehensible bill. It's a bill that's based on a number of myths and lies, frankly, and that requires people to believe that there are people around really saying that oil and gas is going to be stopped immediately and won't continue to play a substantial role, as it will, in the energy economy up to 2050. No one is saying that oil and gas will not continue over a period of time, and no one is saying that existing fields in the UK that we have at the moment will not continue to produce and contribute their products in the future. And there will be jobs in that continuing North Sea oil operation. But it's a one-clause bill with effectively 2 sections in it. And one, the first section, ostentatiously requires the Oil and Gas Authority to do what it is already doing. And indeed, the Honourable Member for Angus and indeed the member for Brighton Pavilion reminded us that the Oil and Gas Authority has been carrying out regular licensing rounds every 18 months since 2016, and of course they are required to do that because they are under the requirement of maximum economic extraction. All that's already in legislation, and the Oil and Gas Authority is already doing that. And the second section, setting out an entirely bogus climate test, which by definition cannot be failed. And that's achieved by skewing the test conditions to test UK gas production emissions only against aggregate LNG imports, which are overall likely to be dirtier in production than UK gas, and not against pipeline delivered gas, which in the case of our main importer Norway is half as dirty in production as is in the UK. And there is no emissions test for oil, despite it constituting 70% of North Sea fossil reserves, 80% of which we've heard is shipped and refined overseas. But for oil, there is a net importer test, which requires the OGA to issue licences if the demand for oil and gas products in the UK is greater than production, when this has been the case in the North Sea for 20 years and no prospect of reversal. A bill built on completely bogus premises.
To avert catastrophe, we must work now towards a fossil-free future. So why does our government keep insisting on keeping us in the past and trying to build our recovery on a resource that the world has formally committed to moving away from? The government claims that it's about lowering household bills. Well, even the Energy Secretary admitted that it won't. Because the energy generated from new oil and gas would not belong to the British people, powering our homes for cheap. It would be in the hands of private companies and sold on the global markets for internationally set prices. It would be owned by those same energy companies that have already made record-breaking profits in the cost of living crisis, while 13 million households sat in the cold last winter too scared to turn on the heating. Madam Deputy Speaker, those corporations don't need any more state handouts. If the government really cared about energy bills, it would be funding a mass programme of insulating homes, which the Tories slashed support for in 2013. If it cared about securing our future, it would be focusing on investing in publicly owned homegrown renewables, which have never been cheaper. It would be delivering a Green New Deal to protect our living standards and our planet for decades to come. And it's not just the Climate Change Committee that has warned against new fossil fuels. So has the UN Secretary-General. He called, and members opposite would do well to listen to this, he called on all nations to cease all licensing or funding of new oil and gas. So has the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which said no new oil and gas development is possible if the world is to stay within the Paris Agreement temperature limits. So has the International Energy Agency, whose director said, if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas and coal. And so have over 700 scientists who wrote to the PM last year, asking him to halt the licensing. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, should we be taking advice from hundreds of leading climate experts or from lobbyists for fossil fuel industries? The bill in front of us won't solve any of our problems. It will just contribute to wrecking the planet and undermine our climate credibility on the international stage. So, for the sake of our futures and our planet, I urge the House to vote down this dangerous bill.